Well, good evening, and welcome to another presentation from the Hallelujah Diet. It's a real privilege to be with you this evening. I'm Paul Malkmus, president of Hallelujah Diet, and we have a wonderful presentation for you this evening, and we'll get to that here just as quick as we can. But before we do, I'd like to first open with a word of prayer, and then just cover a housekeeping issue there. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this time this evening, Lord, where we can present some life-changing information. We pray that you'll be with the speaker and with the technology, and everything will go smoothly, and that we honor you with the presentation. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, this application here, it has a place where you can communicate with us. So if you have any questions or concerns during the presentation, just down in the bottom left-hand corner, type in the comment, and we'll hold the questions for the end, and we'll do a question and answer session with our speaker after the presentation. And, this is the second time that we've had Dr. Siobhan with us, and she's a board-certified graduate of the University of Bridgeport College of Naturopathic Medicine. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in biomedical engineering, and that complemented her training and collectively paved the way for her teaching biological and clinical sciences on the university level. As a medical educator at Bilcus Biotech, Dr. Siobhan leads their scientific advisory team, facilitating world-renowned researchers in the design and implementation of their investigations into clinically important and industry-esteemed process-patented phytochemicals. And it's a real privilege for us to have Dr. Siobhan with us again. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I think you should have the presentation at this point.
Very good. So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for logging in tonight and watching this presentation. Again, I hope that it's useful for someone you know, yourself, or your community. So the title of this presentation is Your Liver Protected. We are going to learn why liver health is very important, how to keep it healthy, and we are really going to focus on one of the most prevalent liver diseases or dysfunctional conditions that we are aware of today, and that is kind of gaining significant ground in terms of its impact in Western culture and in cultures around the world. So the presentation, as I said, will focus on a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We also abbreviate it as NAFLD. NAFLD is a condition, we'll talk a little bit more about it, that affects a large percentage of the population. It's very connected with obesity and diabetes and other lifestyle conditions. So I have a question for you guys. If you've heard of NAFLD before today's introduction, let me know. If not, I also would like to know whether or not you've ever heard of this condition. As I mentioned, it's gaining significant importance because we see that the rates of obesity are going up. We see that the rates of diabetes are going up, and it's having a direct correlation to both of those conditions. And it's very difficult to diagnose. And so for that reason, we often don't see its full manifestations until it's really not too late, but definitely caused some damage. So from the poll so far, I can see out of those who have responded that the majority of you guys have not seen or heard of NAFLD before. So this should be a very interesting presentation for you. For those of you that have, I hope to be able to explain a little bit more about the condition and to give you some tips and tools as to how to prevent this condition from occurring, and also how to help those who do have this condition or who may be at risk for this condition to reverse some of those changes. Very good. So this slide here is going to give us some fast facts about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It stands, NAFLD stands, as I said, for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is different than alcoholic fatty liver disease, or alcoholic liver disease, sometimes called, where a person, due to alcoholism, will develop damage to the liver, which might end up in cirrhosis, and then the kind of consequences of that, which may need liver transplants or things of that nature. So this is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and we'll talk about what that exactly means. How it is kind of diagnosed or how it's characterized is by increased fat in the tissue, in the network of the liver itself. This is also termed steatosis, so you might hear me use that term pretty frequently in the presentation. Other aspects of NAFLD include inflammation in the liver. Hepatocytes are the liver cells, so liver cell ballooning. That ballooning happens when the liver cells get so filled with fat that the individual barriers or the individual kind of cell membrane that divides and separates every cell from its neighbor becomes very thin until the point where it disappears or it becomes obliterated in a way. And so you have all of these liver cells that are full of fat starting to balloon and kind of coalesce with one another, kind of merge with one another. The other aspect of NAFLD as it progresses is fibrosis. And fibrosis is when scar tissue gets deposited into the liver because of so much damage. It's also staged, as I mentioned, by the presence of obesity, Western diet, high-fat diet, high cholesterol diet, low in phytonutrients, low in fiber, and being overweight. Also in the context of diabetes, insulin resistance, and prediabetes as well. The big issue with NAFLD is that it's usually asymptomatic, which means there's really no way of knowing that it is taking place, that it's developing. It's about 10 to 15 years in the making, which is a very long time. It's very similar to high blood pressure. Sometimes people are diagnosed with high blood pressure, and they say, well, where did this come from? It kind of appeared out of nowhere. Well, it's been in the making for years and years and years as the dysfunction has been building within the body. The NAFLD picture is reversible at its earliest stages. So in the stages where you just see small depositions of fat throughout the liver, at that stage it's generally reversible. Even where there's inflammation, there's some ability to reverse. But as those liver cells become damaged, and I told you the barriers around each of those liver cells become obliterated, they start to kind of merge together and you get the deposition of scar tissue. At this point, it becomes less and less reversible. The cause of NAFLD is multifactorial. And because it's multifactorial, many things kind of adding in and kind of building on top of one of another, this is why there, at this point in time, are no direct acting medications. So in terms of the pharmaceutical industry, they're in a big rush. There's a lot of drugs that have been appraised or evaluated. They've gotten to a certain level of evaluation in terms of studies and the FDA, but they haven't proven to affect too many of those areas of fatty liver disease. So there are no direct acting medications at this moment. We'll talk about what is done currently. It's scored by a system called the NAFLD Activity Scoring System, or NASH system. We'll talk about that. It is a stronger predictor of cardiovascular disease than that apple shape that we are often told about, or having abdominal obesity. So this is something, again, where you kind of don't know that it's happening, but it has a strong impact on your cardiovascular state and on your cardiovascular health. As I mentioned, it can progress to inflammation and ballooning of the tissue and scar tissue deposition. We collectively call that NASH. NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. We'll talk about that itis and what that actually means. That differentiates it from NAFLD. But beyond NASH, it develops into cirrhosis, where the liver actually will shrink. It becomes very bumpy and fibrous. And then eventually liver cancer could be one of the downstream effects. If not liver cancer, then once the liver becomes so cirrhotic, so fibrous, so shrunken and dysfunctional, the likelihood of needing a liver transplant would be the other direction that this situation goes into. So I just want to talk about a little bit of the anatomy and physiology of the liver. The liver, if you're not sure, is located on the right side of the body. It is pretty much under your rib cage. So if you can locate your rib cage right now and you kind of, if you could even lift up under your rib cage, you would be touching your liver on the right-hand side. And actually, the part of the liver that hangs down below the rib cage is right about here. So I'm going to just highlight that area to you guys. You can see the liver is in this section. I'm kind of encircling it with my red pencil. That's your liver, right-hand side, right underneath your rib cage. And your rib cage would kind of go like this, okay? And just this little tiny portion of the liver hangs below the rib cage. And so a doctor can even evaluate the size of the liver just by kind of palpating and touching along that area to see if more than just that small portion of the liver is hanging below. Not only palpation, but sometimes they will do kind of this thumping where they'll put their finger on top of your abdomen in that particular area, and they will tap their finger. And what they're trying to do is listen for the difference in resonance or the sound, because the liver is a very dense tissue, and so it will sound different than if they're tapping over an empty area. So that's how they can identify the liver. That's also how we can talk a little bit about damage that occurs to the liver, because in the early stages of NAFLD, the liver will become enlarged because it's full of fat. The later stages of NAFLD, we talked about, it will become shrunken, and so they may not even be able to find that little, area that should normally hang below. So what does the liver actually do for us? The liver is important in producing bile. Bile is a detergent that helps us break down our fats. Bile is generally stored in the gallbladder. So if you've ever heard of someone needing a gallbladder removed and then having issues with digesting fat in their diet, well, it's because the liver, though it's constantly producing bile, the gallbladder is where that bile is stored, and so that's where some of the issues can come in. So if the liver is damaged, your ability to digest fat well also becomes damaged. And because a lot of the fat that we digest ultimately some of it ends up into our stool, very small portions. If your body is not able to digest and absorb and deal with that fat in such a way, you can have more fat going out into the stool than you're supposed to, and as a result, it can change the consistency of the stool. It makes the stool very loose. Excretion of bilirubin. So bilirubin is a byproduct of bile. It's a pigment, so it helps us to get rid of bilirubin. It helps us to get rid of cholesterol. It helps us to get rid of bilirubin is also the pigment that makes your red blood cells the color it is. That's part of it as well. So the destruction of red blood cells, any of that extra bilirubin will be moved through the liver. Cholesterol and hormones, so for males and females on the line, any hormone production in the body, whether it's male hormones or female hormones from the ovaries, these hormones also get broken down in the liver. Cholesterol from our diet gets broken down in the liver. Drugs get metabolized in the liver, okay? So it's a very important organ. It helps us, as I said, with the breakdown of fats. Additionally, proteins and carbohydrates. We'll talk today about how when that carbohydrate balance is interrupted, like with diabetes or insulin resistance, how this affects the liver. Enzyme activation. So a lot of enzymes that help with different processes in the body, they are activated within the liver. The liver helps us to store forms of sugar, forms of glucose. So if you're eating and then over the night when you're fasting, when your body is still needing nutrients, the liver is putting out some of those stored nutrients, vitamins and minerals. It also helps us keep fluid in the prospective departments that they should be in by creating plasma proteins, also with our clotting mechanism. So if someone has a damaged liver, they can have issues with bruising because they don't have enough blood clotting factors. And finally, detoxification and purification. The liver is so important with keeping the balance between nutrients and toxins or waste products in balance. So just to give you guys a little understanding of the anatomy and how much work the liver is doing for us on a daily basis. Some people think that the heart is the hardest working organ in the body, but I tend to think that the liver works even harder for us. some of the risk factors associated with NAFLD. So you need to know that this condition affects people in the age group between around 40 and 65. We know that it's predominant in Hispanics and Asians. It tends to have a lower risk in African-American populations. We know that some drugs and toxins are at the root of some causes of NAFLD. We also know that women after menopause actually have the same risk of NAFLD as do their male counterparts. So premenopausally, women are at a lower risk for NAFLD, but after menopause, the risk goes up similar to cardiovascular risk as it does to men. So obesity, as I mentioned, this is a big, has a big confounding factor when it comes to NAFLD. So waist circumference of greater than 40 in males or greater than 35 in females. High blood pressure, particularly the diastolic, the bottom number, okay, over 100 milligrams per deciliter. Triglyceride level. So triglycerides are often related to the amount of fat consumed in the diet, but not just fat, the amount of sugar consumed in the diet, particularly simple sugars. Okay, a lot of those simple sugars get turned into fat. We'll talk about how. Also having a low HDL. HDL is our good cholesterol. So when our HDL is low, one of the roles of HDL that most people don't know is that HDL is the carrier protein that removes fat from the liver, right? So, it brings fat from the bloodstream to the liver so that the liver can get rid of that fat through the bowel. So I'll say that again. It is beneficial, HDL, having a high level or, a good level of HDL is beneficial to us because it is the protein that removes fat from, say, cholesterol plaques within our arteries and takes it to the liver so that the liver can break it down and move it out of the body. So having a low HDL means that the liver is not moving things the way it should. It's not as efficient as it needs to be in removing that cholesterol from the blood vessels, getting it to the liver, and getting it out of the body. And then overall, having high total blood cholesterol is also a prime risk factor. Other risk factors, we mentioned some things related to genetics and age. Rapid weight loss can also be a risk for NAFLD because, again, as your fat cells shrink with rapid weight loss or with yo-yo dieting, they are releasing fat into the bloodstream. Remember, that fat has to go somewhere. It goes to the liver to be broken down, but if the liver is overwhelmed or doesn't have what it needs in terms of nutrients, it cannot do a good job of removing that fat, and so it kind of accumulates there and it puts us at risk for steatosis. I mentioned to you guys this term steatosis, meaning fat accumulation in the liver, but what I didn't mention to you is how much fat is considered the kind of parameter for NAFLD. So the amount of fat that is diagnostic is around 5 to 6% fat accumulation in the liver. Doesn't seem like a lot, but the liver shouldn't really be accumulating hardly any fat, okay? Another risk factor is intestinal permeability. We've also heard of this term as leaky gut. Leaky gut puts us at risk for NAFLD, and leaky gut, we know that it is linked to many, many, many conditions, especially inflammatory conditions, and we'll talk about its link to NAFLD soon as well. Certain medications, I talked to you guys about certain medications being linked to NAFLD. All right, so early signs and symptoms of the disease. You can see here in this picture to our right that a healthy liver should be shiny, okay? That's one of the things that you should see. You can kind of see the glistening of light on the liver. The liver should be shiny. The liver should be this nice pink color. If you've ever seen or used or have seen this anywhere, calf liver or something like that, or chicken liver or something of that nature, it kind of gives you the same idea. It's that pinkish, purplish color. You can also see that there are not any kind of yellow spots, okay? Those yellow spots that you see with fatty liver, you can see the liver on average has changed color. You can also see that it's lost its shine. And what you see, the biggest thing you can see where I'm putting these green arrows are all of these areas where you have the deposition of fat, and we see fat in the body as yellow tissue. So the deposition of fat throughout this liver has actually changed the overall color. Now, what are some of the signs and symptoms of liver disease? None. Okay, so this is why it's insidious. This is why it creeps up on people. This is why it takes 10 to 15 years, because often there are no symptoms at all. Now, some of the lesser symptoms that may happen in particular people or may kind of give you an inclination that something weird is going on, something dysfunctional is happening, is fatigue that cannot be associated with anything else. So you've ruled out every other cause of fatigue. You've addressed every other reason why fatigue is there, and fatigue still remains. That could be linked to the process happening into the liver. High cholesterol. High cholesterol, as we talked about, is a risk factor. It's a causative agent, but it can also be a symptom because, again, as the liver is accumulated and saturated with fat, that fat has nowhere to go, and so it will continue to stay in the bloodstream. Any additional fat, it will hang out in the bloodstream because it can't go anywhere else. Hypertension, why? Because as that fat backs up into the bloodstream, it gets deposited backwards into the blood vessels, and therefore as the blood vessel diameter decreases because of fat being deposited around the perimeter, that leads to increased pressure within the system, in the body. And so while high cholesterol and hypertension can be risk factors, they also can be symptoms as well of the progress of the disease. And then the last one is a big word. Maybe you've heard of it or not. This is called gynecomastia, and this is very specific to men. So because of the fat deposits in the liver, because of the destruction of the liver, and because some of the things that we talked about the liver is supposed to do, okay, including the processing of hormones, in men, the liver dysfunction will lead to an imbalance between testosterone and estrogen. In fact, estrogen will appear higher, either relatively or truly appear higher than testosterone, and that will lead to the stimulation of breast tissue. And so in a male, that can lead to what looks like breast, the similar kind of breast enlargement as you would see in a woman. And so we call that gynecomastia as the medical term. All right, so I have another question for you guys. How many people do you know, including yourself, if applicable, are diabetic? If you know between 0 and 5 people off the top of your head, if you know between 6 or 10 people, please mark there. And if you know more than 11 people that are diabetic off the top of your head, please click the third poll circle. I can see the numbers coming in. Almost everyone, and I can just raise my hand right now thinking of immediate family members that are diabetic. And my numbers are definitely teetering between 0 and 5 people, maybe 6 to 10 people. So as these numbers are coming in, I see more than, I would say at least a third of you, 3/4 of you guys are responding with more than between 0 and 5 people with diabetes. So diabetes, as I mentioned, is a huge, huge risk factor for NAFLD, so we got to talk about it. Some of you guys, maybe 10% of the people on the line, 9 or 10%, know 11 or more people who are diabetic. And you know, learning about this NAFLD will definitely help them in order to, you know, maybe prevent the progression of NAFLD as you share this information. So thank you for being on. So let's look at the effects of type 2 diabetes on the liver. So there's a lot of stuff going on in these two pictures, okay? So there's an A picture, which is the normal function. There's a B picture. So I'm going to start at the brain, and I'm just going to kind of talk us through this whole thing. I will follow my direction with a red marker, okay? So we're going to start here at the brain. So what happens is, in the normal situation, the brain will, it's kind of like the thermostat. The brain will recognize when there's sufficient sugar. The brain relies on sugar as a fuel source. So it will be able to recognize when there's sufficient sugar available, glucose available to the brain, and when there's insufficient amount available to the brain. So in the normal situation, we're talking about here in A, okay? In the normal healthy scenario, the brain will be able to pick up a signal that says, okay, there's not enough glucose coming, there's not enough energy coming to the brain to do the functions that the brain needs to do. So the brain will send out a signal, okay, it's called a sympathetic outflow. It's like a stress, like a fight or flight mechanism, okay, because the brain is kind of at this point suffering. And so we'll send out this stress mechanism to tell the fat cells to start to break down some fat, okay? Similarly, at the same time, the pancreas, okay, the pancreas is also sensing the level of glucose in the blood. And so the pancreas will respond by talking to the brain, okay, you can see here, telling the brain, hey, there's not enough, more is coming, whatever, and it will talk to the fat cells, okay? Now, how does it talk to the fat cells? We know the brain is talking to the fat cells by triggering a stress response. The pancreas is talking to the fat cells by releasing insulin. Why? Insulin is telling us that, guess what, we need to get whatever sugar is now being produced, maybe broken down from the fat, maybe released from the liver, maybe taken in our diet. We need to get that glucose into the cell. So insulin is the gateway, all right? So it will release insulin so that the sugar, the glucose can flow into the cells, flow into the brain, and recharge the brain, refuel the brain. In terms of the fat, what will be happening, both with signals from the brain and signals from the pancreas, is that lipolysis will happen. Lipolysis means that the fat cells will break down and they will release fat, okay? Those fats will then move to the liver, and the fats will help us with a process that will either increase the production of fat within the liver that can then be turned into glucose, and then that glucose will fuel the brain. And so it's kind of like this pattern of flow, like a cycle, okay? So this is under normal conditions. Now let's see what happens under abnormal conditions, okay? Under abnormal conditions such as diabetes, we're going to start again with the brain. And let me just erase everything here. Okay, we erase A and we start with B. Now, in diabetes, we're going to use the brain again as our starting place. The brain recognizes, hey, there's not enough glucose being delivered, okay? Not only is there not enough glucose, but when the pancreas picks that up, that there's not enough glucose, what's the issue with diabetes? The pancreas is not properly working. So when the pancreas goes to put out insulin, we talked about it being a gatekeeper to allow sugar to move into the cells so that the brain can refuel and work the way it's supposed to. It's not able to produce insulin. So the lack of insulin causes this dysfunctional process to happen. So the brain will try to talk to these fat cells, okay? The fat cells will get the stress signal from the brain. They will start to release fat into the bloodstream. You can see an increase in free fatty acids, so an increase of fat flowing into the bloodstream. What happens now is that the liver will increase the production of a storage form of fat called triglycerides, okay? That storage form of fat, you can see now that the liver, which was once pink, turns into this yellowish color that we talked about, because not only is this increased production of storage fat occurring, but the secretion or the release of that fat into the system to try to refuel the brain is not happening. So all of that fat actually gets stuck in the liver, okay? Not only that, the brain continues to, the brain will eventually get fuel because some of that fat will get turned into glucose eventually, but it doesn't happen in a way that is efficient, okay? So again, the fact that there is not enough glucose going to the tissue, the pancreas can't respond the way it should, It can't produce that insulin. Therefore, there's a breakdown of fat. That fat flows into the bloodstream. It gets directed to the liver. The liver stores it. There's an increase in storage. At the same time, because there's this imbalance or dysfunction happening, there's a decrease in removal or a decrease in secretion away from the liver. As a result, this nice pink liver develops into this bumpy yellow liver, which over time becomes inflamed and damaged. Okay? I know some questions might come out of this, so we can go back to it later. So let's look at the reality of this situation. Okay, a third of Americans live currently with NAFLD. And I just need to make one correction here that I didn't figure out until we just got on. This 1/3 of Americans, about 5% of the population, the U.S. population, which totals 16 million people, have progressed from just that steatosis stage where there's just fat accumulating in the liver to the inflammatory, damaging scar tissue stage we call NASH. Okay, 16 million people, all right, are walking around with a truly dysfunctional liver because of this imbalance in metabolism. 10% of the global population lives with this inflammatory form of NAFLD. About 10%, okay, of U.S. children between the age of 2 and 19 years old are living with NAFLD, fatty liver disease. Can you imagine? 10% of U.S. children. By 2020, NASH, remember, NASH is the developed form of NAFLD, the inflammatory scar tissue form. NASH is expected to become the leading cause of liver transplants in the U.S. by 2020. That means only 2 years from now, okay? It's not that far away. And we know that as obesity and type 2 diabetes rise, so will fatty liver disease. And unfortunately, in actuality, the rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes are expected to double, okay? And as they double, so will the rates of NAFLD. We know now that about a third of Americans are obese. By 2030, it's expected that 50% of Americans will be obese. So imagine how the level of fatty liver disease will go up as a result. One diabetes diagnosis happens every 19 seconds, okay? Every 19 seconds. By 2030, we are expecting, again, 20% of the population, 50% of them will be obese and 20% of them will have diabetes, okay? And so we know that those rates of NAFLD will go up accordingly. So I want to just talk about, in addition to the damage that's happening when you get too much of this fat deposited in the tissue as a result of insulin resistance or low insulin levels because of diabetes, we know that you get this fat developed in the tissue. So we talked a lot about this part here, okay? I just highlighted here in yellow. We talked about the fat in the tissue. But I want to bring to your attention a couple other things that are happening simultaneously. I mentioned to you guys that there's a risk factor for NAFLD, which includes intestinal permeability or leaky gut. So as we have damage to the GI tract, including imbalance in the microbes, so dysbiosis or low levels of probiotics, what you get is damage that happens to the lining of the blood vessel. You also get increase in the movement of bacteria inside of the bloodstream. And as a result, the body will activate an inflammatory process because of that permeability. That bacteria, that inflammatory process, creates these free radicals on top of the fat. So what you see here under NASH is the inflammation that happens, the inflammation coming from the intestinal permeability, the inflammation happening just because you have this disruptive process of fat, excess fat deposits in the liver. You get damage due to oxidative stress. So free radicals come in and they start to eat away at this fat that leads to very kind of labile fat, which means this fat is really, really, really damaging at that point. It damages the liver cells, and the blue that you see here The blue represents scar tissue. So as the liver cells start to become so damaged, they will die, and what is replaced is not functional liver cells, but scar tissue. And that scar tissue is not functional. It doesn't do all of those jobs that we listed under the physiology of the liver. And instead, at this point, the liver becomes so damaged, it can't go backwards. So this is showing you this dysfunction to disease, right? So we talked about stage 1. You got a healthy liver going on. You get this fat accumulation that's happening. We know that diabetes can play a part in here, or insulin resistance, okay, at this stage. And then that gives us type 1, okay? So you just got steatosis. We talked about 5% in the liver. When you get these other things added in, like bacteria, inflammatory processes, imbalance, and free radicals and things of that nature, you get inflammation that adds into that steatosis. So we call that type 2. Type 3 is when you move beyond inflammation and now you start getting the ballooning. Remember I told you these liver cells become so big because the walls start to disintegrate and you get so much accumulation of fat that they start to coalesce or merge together. That's type 3. Type 4, because of the damage, the oxidative stress, the free radicals, the bacteria, the inflammatory process, and all of this on top of the fatty liver, you get fibrosis. You get damage to the liver cells where they cannot reconcile that damage, they die, and you get scar tissue deposition. Scar tissue deposition causes the liver to shrink. It causes it to get very bumpy and knotty. It actually will go from pink to yellow. It shows here as purple, but it really goes to green, okay? And that's when the liver is so damaged it can't do the job. Either you're at risk for a liver transplant or maybe the liver goes into a cancerous state. All right, so other things that put people at risk, ketogenic diets. These are very popular right now. They also are a clinical strategy for some populations, so they're used, say, in the case of epilepsy. They work very well in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. They are also a strategy, a critical strategy some clinicians or doctors will use to help people with those conditions. But they are trendy right now because of the dramatic weight loss that comes with it. I actually have a coworker who has lost a lot of weight, like 40 pounds in a very short period of time doing a ketogenic diet. They work very well at the onset because they are a very low-carb diet, not as low-carb as an Atkins diet, but very close. They're less than 20% carbs. There's a moderate amount of protein, but there's significant fat. And the people that are doing the ketogenic diets are really not balancing their carbs in terms of good carbs, vegetables, fruits. They tend to do a lot of refined carbohydrates, and they tend not to get their protein and fat from vegetable sources, but they tend to rely a lot on animal sources. Now, what happens with these ketogenic diets, if we go back to some of those other images I had for you guys, you see that there's a breakdown of fat there's a lack of carbohydrate. So it's almost like the brain is sensing a lack of carbohydrate, and we know all of the processes that will ensue as a result of lack of carbohydrate. We talked about how when there's not enough carbohydrates, you actually see that one of the effects here is for the fat to start to release some, for the fatty tissue to start to release some of those fats. And that's how they get weight loss very, very quickly. But we know as a result, those fats go into the bloodstream, and if it happens in too short of a period of time before the liver can really accommodate that kind of stress, we know we get increase in fat storage and we get decrease in fat removal, and as a result, fatty liver develops. Okay, so that's really the connection to ketogenic diets. The research on it in terms of its relationship to fatty liver disease is kind of not clear. So in animals, we know for sure, in animal studies that have been done, it is for sure that ketogenic diets increase the risk of fatty liver disease. But it hasn't been confirmed in humans yet because there's been some conflicting research that's developed. We do know that its benefits in terms of regulating diabetes and blood sugar imbalances are time dependent. So we know that in the early stages, when it's used short term to kind of get people on a quick, fast track to weight loss or to help them curb their carbohydrate intake, that it works pretty well. But in the animal studies, they saw fatty liver-like changes happening in as early as 5 weeks. So maybe at a month onset, doing a ketogenic diet could be beneficial, but people that extended for significant periods beyond that, they start to show some damage, NAFLD-like changes to the liver. We also know that it's restriction dependent. When it's super, super low carb, like 20% or less, you have more risk of fatty liver disease. When it's moderate carbs, like 30%, there's less of a risk. And then there also is a risk to those who have a predisposition to either insulin resistance or to liver damage in general. Those people tend to be at risk when they do the ketogenic diet, and so they probably should pay attention to that. So what is the way that we treat or we address NAFLD? Diet right now, because there are no medications, is the first-line therapy. We do know that when a person loses between 5 and 9% of their weight, body weight, that NAFLD goes down, okay? We know that the damage to the liver goes down because there's certain blood tests. We call them liver function tests, AST, ALT, GGT. These are all on, generally requested in annual blood work. We know that these markers go down when a person loses between 5 and 9%. Closer to 9, the better the effect. Other risk factors go down. So we also know when a person loses close to 10% of their body weight, that their blood pressure goes down, that triglyceride levels go down, total cholesterol, LDL, and even BMI obviously will go down. So other risk factors are benefited. We also know that when people lose this much of their weight, that the damage to the hepatocytes, remember those are liver cells, the rate of death that occurs in those liver cells in people that have NASH, the exaggerated form of NAFLD, that goes down. But what we do know that remains that diet is not able to address are some of the inflammation and oxidative stress or free radical markers that are showing up on blood tests. Okay, so these are some of them: TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, NDA. These are levels that do not show change just by fixing the diet. So yes, the liver is getting better, but some of those other aspects of damage to the liver do not change when weight loss is the only thing applied. Exercise, we know, adds to the benefit of weight loss. Exercise also makes the insulin receptors more sensitive. So in a diabetic person, this is another way to get more control over blood sugar. Okay, and so ultimately that will help NAFLD. As far as drugs, I mentioned previously that there are no NAFLD medications, no direct-acting medications, because there's so many things happening at the same time. There's insulin resistance, there's inflammation, there's free radical damage, and then there's endotoxemia, which is the kind of toxic effects of having bacteria in the system, okay, caused by leaky gut. There are some secondary drugs that are used to treat NAFLD, so those include diabetes medications. They will be used indirectly to try to control the diabetes and thereby control the NAFLD, but they're not beneficial overall. And also anti-inflammatory drugs could be used. Vitamin E is actually the only approved treatment right now that kind of deals with multiple factors of NAFLD, so just simple old vitamin E. However, we know that curcumin, which is one of the products we highlight tonight, has 10 times the antioxidant benefits of vitamin E, 10 times more powerful. And on top of that, curcumin is an anti-inflammatory. So I'm going to share with you guys some research that was done with curcumin in NAFLD. Because of this multifactorial activity, we know that the benefits that curcumin can provide are more diverse than what vitamin E can provide, and also more diverse than what these secondary drugs like the diabetes medications and anti-inflammatory medications can provide. Curcumin is an antioxidant, I told you, 10 times more potent than vitamin E. It has multidimensional functions, which means it not just helps you with replenishing vitamin E and vitamin A and those kind of antioxidants, but it also helps with your systemic antioxidant levels like glutathione superoxide dismutase, and other important antioxidant enzyme systems. It also helps with the mother of all antioxidants, which is called NRF factor 2. NRF2 is kind of it sets off all of the kind of antioxidants within the entire system, okay? So it's kind of the mother of all antioxidants. So it's multidimensional. It's anti-inflammatory. It directly protects the liver, has an affinity for the liver. Actually, it gets metabolized and changed in the liver. It's gut reparative, so that aspect of leaky gut, it also has benefit there. And it is a blood sugar support kind of ingredient as well. So these are some of the other benefits associated with curcumin. And the curcumin that's in the Hallelujah Acres product has both curcuminoids and essential oils. And this is a patented blend. The essential oils, also known as AR turmerones, they come directly from turmeric. They come directly from the rhizome that you see here. It looks like ginger. So within here, there are two components. There's a component that gives the pigment or this nice, beautiful yellow color. But there's also the component that gives the aroma to curcumin, to turmeric, what you smell in curries and anytime you cook with it. It's very aromatic spice. So the essential oils are giving that aroma while the curcuminoids are giving that pigment. So the two of them combined is what makes this curcumin product that Hallelujah Acres has very potent. It has high bioavailability, 7 times more than what you would get if you were to just kind of use the root itself and grind it up and put it in your smoothie or whatever, or cook it in your food. It's very potent. It has studies behind it. It's been proven to be clinically effective. And these are all of the different benefits associated just with the pigment here in orange, and then also associated just with the oil. And you can see there's redundancy. So it's anti-inflammatory here, anti-inflammatory there, antimicrobial here, antimicrobial here. And so the benefit that you get is that you have more than 1 + 1 equaling 2 here. You have synergism. And so that's why this is a pretty potent product. Quick question. This is my last question for you guys. Do any of you currently take supplemental curcumin, whether it's from Hallelujah Acres brand or any other brand? If you take it for liver health, please mark that. If you take it for cancer protection, mark that. If you take it for other reasons, like some of those that I mentioned, mark that as well. If you don't take it at all, please also let us know, because as we mentioned previously, you can see the multitude of effects that curcumin could, provide benefit for. All right, so I see here that a few people are already taking it for liver health. I see that more than half of the respondents are not taking curcumin at all. Thank you for being honest, but that gives room at least for you to consider a curcumin product in your regimen. Some people are also taking, maybe about half, a little less than half, are taking for other reasons. And then some people are taking for cancer prevention, because that's one of the big areas that curcumin is studied for. So thank you so much, guys, for responding to that. All right, so quickly we're going to finish the last couple slides, and then we're going to be done. But I just want to talk to you guys about a study that was done recently on this curcumin product that Hallelujah Acres has. So this study looked at NAFLD. They wanted to look at a model in prevention, so to prevent it. So this is someone who may, say, have some of those risk factors. Maybe they're in the age group between 45 and 60, or 45 and 65. Maybe they are entering, this is a woman who's entering menopause who is insulin resistant and overweight. They have the risk factors there, but they don't actually have the disease taking place yet that they know of. We also have a treatment group. So the treatment group is down here. And the treatment group, these are people who already had fatty liver disease. Actually, not only did they have fatty liver disease, they already had the presence of the at least minimum 5% fat in the liver, and they also had some inflammatory changes taking place. They even had very, very slight ballooning happening. Not much, but just a little bit. No fibrosis yet, but they did have some. So what they did here is, in order to develop these mice, in order to give them fatty liver, they fed them for a series of weeks on a Western diet. So this is a high-fat diet that includes a high amount of cholesterol. It is like the, fat American diet or standard American diet. They had about 12 mice in each group, and they sustained them on this high-fat diet. So about 2% of it was cholesterol, which is considered, high cholesterol diet, and they let them feed as much as they wanted on water that had about 15% fructose, fruit sugar added to it. So they had ad lib availability of this water. So this high sugar plus high fat diet came together to create fatty liver. Now, if this would just be a dietary induced model, it would take a long time to develop. So the researchers also included just a little small tiny dose of a liver toxin. The liver toxin was dosed at 1, 2, and 6 weeks. And what that did was it kind of expedited the model. It made the fatty liver develop a little more quickly. So what they did is they had an arm or one part of the study that did not get BCM, okay, so that's this part you see here, and then they had one arm that did get BCM. So the one arm that didn't get BCM, as you can assume, it developed fatty liver, so we can see all those little yellow spots. The arm that got BCM, well, they developed some changes that protected them from fatty liver deposition. They still had some aspects of fatty liver, but it was overall protected, and we'll talk about some of those benefits. The treatment group actually had the biggest and most significant effects. Now, in the treatment group, as I mentioned to you, instead of giving them the curcumin products for all 8 weeks and comparing it to a group that didn't have curcumin, they gave the diet with the water and the high fat plus the toxin for all 8 weeks in both groups. And then only at the very end, you can see here, from week 8 to week 12, did they give the curcumin product. So they wanted to create fatty liver first, just like they did here, okay, at the same time point. And then they wanted to see if you could reverse that if you gave curcumin versus if you didn't give curcumin. As you can assume, the group that was not giving curcumin developed fatty liver. The group that did get curcumin, well, they had some very interesting results. The results were that there was decreased fat deposition in the liver tissue. So they were able to do an analysis of the liver tissue. They saw decreased fat there. They also saw that not as much fat was moving in the direction of the liver, and they were able to identify this by looking for certain markers. This marker is called ApoB100. They found decreased liver inflammation. They found a decrease in the scoring that I talked to you guys about. The NAFLD is scored based off of a number between 0 and 8. So between 0 and 4, the body can kind of reverse it on its own. From the numbers of 5 to 8, that's when you start getting into the inflammation, and you get beyond the inflammation to the ballooning and the fibrosis. It's very hard to reverse at that point. We saw more than a close to 2-point reduction in that scoring. So that means if someone was borderline fatty liver disease, they were able to be put back into the point of the disease where it was not really, fully presenting. And if they had a form of fatty liver disease that was reaching numbers 5 or 6, just with taking curcumin over those 4 weeks, we saw that they were able to push their score back by almost 2 whole points. We saw a decrease in liver injury. So remember I told you guys with doing weight loss, between 5% and 10% weight loss, they also saw a decrease in these liver function tests that you see on your blood work. But what they did not find with diet alone is they saw no change in oxidative stress or free radicals. But taking curcumin, we saw increase in glutathione, increase in antioxidant activity. We saw a decrease in inflammation, which you didn't see with the diet alone. And you saw a decrease in not just insulin resistance, but glucose resistance, particularly related to the liver. So that was quite significant. This study was published just this year in July in what's called the Physiology Reports journal, okay, and that's the author there. All right, so quick question. Can I just eat with more curry, or can I just cook with more turmeric? Yes, you can, but to get these kind of results is hard, because if you look at curry powder is this big blue circle. the amount of turmeric in curry powder is just this little green circle. Why is that? Because curry powder itself has many other spices. It has coriander, it has cumin, it has other East Asian spices that make it so yummy, but turmeric is only one component. And then if you look at turmeric, which was that root that looks just like ginger, the amount of curcumin, which is the active ingredient, is only around maybe 2 to 5%. Particularly in the spice, you're going to find it really low, like 2%, right? So most of that curcumin is unabsorbed. A lot of it is excreted in the feces. A lot of it is acted on by liver enzymes to disable it or make it unusable. Same thing with some of the gut enzymes. And then at the same time, the active form is not really found in the plasma. And that's why the product that Hawley uses, they combine the curcuminoids along with the essential oils. And that combination of curcuminoids plus the essential oils makes it so that it's able to absorb, makes it so that it's able to avoid those enzymes that would normally break it down, and makes it so that it's clinically effective. This product has a curcumin ingredient in there, which is termed BCM-95. That's the trademark of the ingredient. This is 100% turmeric derived, which means it's not using any other kind of binders or fillers or excipients. It's close to nature. It's a very clean product. It's unadulterated. And the product itself has a 15-year track history for safety. It's a very safe ingredient. It has the synergism we talked about because 1 + 1 = more than 2 in this case. We talked about bioavailability, which makes it absorbable and able to get to the cells like the liver to do its job. And it has all of the research behind it. So that's it for me, guys. I really thank you so much for your time. These are all of the references that I used in producing this presentation. And I thank you so much for watching. And, Paul, I'll take any questions that you want to let me know of.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sivan. It's incredible information. And, you know, I've been taking biocurcumin for a long time, but I didn't realize the positive effect it had on the liver. So that was really interesting. We have one question here. We'll go ahead and take that because I know we're pushing up on time. But somebody asked if they drank 2-liter bottle of Pepsi each day for 10 years, does that do damage to their liver?
I can't say for sure, but in theory I would definitely say yes because the Pepsi is full of sugar, right? I mean, that's what gives it its taste. The sugar content in a soda, I can tell you for a can, I believe there's about, if I remember correctly, there's about 5 teaspoons of sugar per can of soda. So you can imagine the amount of sugar coming in a 2-liter bottle. And on a consistent basis, that is flooding the body with sugar has to cause some disruption in the way that the pancreas handles insulin and is able to produce insulin. So if that person is not diabetic yet, it would possibly lead them to being diabetic, and I would probably most likely think that they are insulin resistant if they're not diabetic yet. And having that low insulin resistance is what sets off that entire cascade we talked about, which includes the production of fat as the fat tissue releases fat goes into the bloodstream, that fat getting deposited into the liver and being unable to move, being stored and not released, and therefore accumulating as fatty liver or steatosis. So I would say, Paul, I can't say for sure, but likely if the person's not diabetic, probably insulin resistant, and yes, on a pathway to having steatosis for sure.
So if somebody was starting to feel like they had, some fatty liver damage, how many pills of biocurcumin would they take, and then would they take it with food or without food?
Oh, good question. So the study that was done in these mice, the correlate of the correlate of the dosing in the rodents, they consumed because they were fed curcumin within their food. It was integrated into their food. So we wanted them to take in roughly the equivalent of, say, 1,000 milligrams of curcumin, because that is the amount of curcumin that has been proven in other areas to be beneficial and to be clinically effective. But what they actually consumed was about 800 milligrams per day. So if the product that you guys have, the BioCurcumin, is that a 400 milligram capsule or 500 milligram capsule, Paul?
I believe it's 400.
Yeah, so if it's a 400 milligram capsule, actually it would be right around the range that the animals took in curcumin. So if they were to do 400 milligram capsule twice a day, that would give them 800 milligrams. And at the same time, you would want to take curcumin all the time with food, because that's the traditional way that curcumin, turmeric, and curries were consumed. So we always want to have food, and if there's any fat in that meal, it helps the absorption even more. So yes, food is always the method of consuming curcumin.
That's awesome. Well, we certainly appreciate your time this evening and the in-depth information. It was certainly enlightening. And my wife and I, Ann, we've been talking a lot about the fatty liver disease because so many people seem to be dealing with it now, and it is becoming an epidemic. So
yes,
we certainly appreciate your insights into it.
Very good. Thank you so much for having me, and I wish all of you listening a wonderful evening. Thanks, Paul.
All right, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll be back next month with another presentation from the Hallelujah Diet. God bless.